In the long, measured rhythm of the 18th century, when Europe still thought in the language of sails and gunpowder, a warship was the most complex object human hands could build. It was a floating city, a wooden fortress, and a machine moved only by the invisible force of the wind. The great navies of Britain, France, and Spain competed not only for empire, but for mastery of the sea. And from that slow rivalry rose the ships that defined an age. Among them stood one vessel whose name would endure longer than any battle she fought, the HMS Victory. Before she ever touched water, Victory existed as an idea in the mind of naval architects who understood both geometry and superstition. The art of ship design in the 1700s was neither exact science nor mere craft. It balanced numbers, wood, and faith. A warship had to carry more than 100 guns, each capable of throwing iron balls through the air with ruinous precision. Yet she also had to float, to turn, to hold steady against storms. Her hull had to be both strong and flexible, her masts tall yet balanced, her rigging a network of lines that could respond to 1,000 commands shouted in wind and thunder. The building of such a ship began in silence, deep in a royal dockyard where the smell of tar, oak, and salt water hung heavy. Thousands of trees were needed, oaks that had grown for centuries. Each trunk was studied, its curve matched to the shape of a rib or beam. Nothing was wasted. The keel, the ship's spine, was laid first, running the full length of the hull, joined in segments with iron bolts and wooden dowels. Over it, the frames rose like the skeleton of some enormous creature, their curves defining the future strength of the vessel. Men worked by hand, measuring with ropes and chalk, guided by patterns drawn on the ground of the mold loft, where the lines of the ship were traced full size on the floor. As the months passed, the hull took form. Planks of oak, steamed and bent, were fastened to the frames with wooden pegs called treenails. The seams were caulked with tarred hemp to keep out the sea. Inside, beams crossed from side to support decks that would one day thunder with cannon. The bow was carved with a graceful curve that could cut through water, and the stern was built high, its galleries ornamented with carved wood and glass like the windows of a floating palace. Every inch of the vessel carried both beauty and purpose. When the hull was complete, it was launched into the water with ceremony. Crowds gathered, flags flew, and the ship slid from her supports into the tide, taking her first breath as a living thing. But a launched hull was not yet a warship. She was only the beginning of a process that would take years. Masts had to be stepped, ropes rigged, guns installed, provisions stored, and the labyrinth of daily life created below decks. The masts rose in 3 great stages: the foremast, the mainmast, and the mizzen. Each was a composition of several timber sections bound with iron hoops. They towered over the deck, supporting yards that would carry the sails. From the top of the mainmast, a lookout could see miles of sea. Yet to climb it required balance and courage, for the rigging was a maze of lines, each with its own name and purpose: stays, shrouds, braces, lifts, halyards. A fully rigged ship like Victory carried more than 20 miles of rope. Below the deck, the ship's inner world took shape. The gun decks were lined with heavy cannon arranged with mathematical symmetry. Each gun had its own crew, its own routine, its own small patch of space in the crowded order of battle. Between them ran the narrow passageways where men would work, eat, and sleep. The lower decks held stores of powder and shot, barrels of salted meat, water casks, and ropes. Far below, in the dark hold, ballast stones and iron bars gave stability. To move such a vessel required knowledge as deep as the sea itself. The captain commanded, but beneath him every man had a role. The bosun managed the rigging, the carpenter cared for the hull, the gunner oversaw the deadly symmetry of the cannons. The crew was a microcosm of society. Officers, midshipmen, sailors, cooks, surgeons, boys. They lived together in wood and wind, bound by discipline as strict as any monastery. The life aboard a warship was ruled by bells, the endless rhythm of time divided into watches. Each watch lasted 4 hours, marked by the ringing of the ship's bell every half hour. The sound carried across the decks, mingling with the creak of timbers and the sigh of the sails. Below, hammocks swung gently in the darkness. The air smelled of salt, tar, and humanity. HMS Victory herself was ordered in 1758, laid down at Chatham Dockyard in 1759, and launched in 1765. She was 186 feet long from stem to stern, 52 feet wide, and displaced more than 3,500 tons. Her crew, when fully manned, numbered over 800 souls. Her hull carried 3 full decks of guns, 104 in all, ranging from 32-pounders on the lower deck to lighter pieces above. She was not the first ship to bear the name Victory, but she would be the last to survive into legend. For more than a decade after her launch, she lay in ordinary, mothballed, her hull protected by tar and lead sheathing, waiting for war. When conflict came, she sailed not as a relic, but as the embodiment of a nation's will to command the sea. The design of her hull allowed her to endure gales, her rigging gave her speed, and her broadside made her feared. Yet her greatness lay not only in firepower, but in balance. Every piece of wood, every rope, every sail worked in harmony. The art of sailing such a ship was a dialogue with nature. Wind was both ally and enemy. The sails, vast sheets of canvas, caught its strength and turned it into motion, but only if trimmed with precision. Too much sail, and the masts could break. Too little, and the ship would drift helplessly. The helmsman steered with a wheel connected by ropes to the rudder, feeling in his hands the pulse of the sea. The officer of the watch shouted commands, echoed by petty officers who relayed them through the decks. Brace the yards, haul taut, let go and haul. The ship moved not as a single body, but as an orchestra of effort. When under full sail, Victory could reach speeds of 9 or 10 knots. In battle formation, she moved more slowly, keeping station with the fleet. Her crew knew her moods, the way she rolled in heavy swell, the way she groaned when the wind shifted. They called her She because no other word could capture her living quality. To live aboard was to inhabit a world of constant motion. Even at anchor, the deck never stood still. Meals were eaten in shifts, bread hard as stone, salted beef tough as rope. Fresh water soon turned stale, so beer and rum were the common drink. Discipline was strict, enforced by the Articles of War, read aloud every Sunday. Flogging was common, desertion rare, courage expected. Yet despite the hardship, many sailors felt pride. They served in something greater than themselves, a machine of oak and canvas that carried the power of a kingdom. Above all, HMS Victory was designed for battle. The order of her decks reflected the hierarchy of war. The lowest deck, close to the waterline, held the largest guns. When these fired, the recoil shook the ship to its bones. The middle deck carried 24-pounders, the upper deck 12-pounders. The gun ports were fitted with hinged lids that could be closed in rough weather, keeping the sea out. Each gun ran on wooden trucks and was restrained by ropes. To load and fire required 12 men, one to swab the barrel, one to insert powder and shot, one to ram it home, others to aim, run out, and fire. In the thunder of battle, commands were given by gesture, for speech could not be heard. Powder was brought up from the magazine in small canvas bags, passed carefully through a screen-lined passage to prevent sparks. The gunner's mate carried it in a leather bucket, his feet bare, lest nails strike sparks from the floor. Every man knew the danger. A single flash could destroy the ship. And yet they worked with calm precision, for in war, calm was the truest courage. Victory's strength was not only in her guns, but in her ability to take punishment. Her hull was built of oak, nearly 2 feet thick in places, able to absorb cannonballs that would smash lesser ships. Her design allowed her to fight broadside to broadside, exchanging fire until one opponent yielded. The smoke of battle, thick and choking, would cover the sea like fog. Amid that confusion, skill and training decided fate. By the close of the 18th century, as technology and tactics evolved, Victory remained a masterpiece of balance between art and necessity. She was not merely built, she was grown from centuries of maritime experience. To walk her decks was to step into the culmination of human craftsmanship before iron and steam changed everything. She was a creation of hands and hearts, of forests and faith, of mathematics and myth. And though her timbers creaked and her sails wore thin, she carried within her frame the unbroken continuity of those who believed that mastery of the sea was mastery of destiny itself. When a great ship like Victory was ready for sea, her life began not with the thunder of guns, but with the rhythm of discipline. Every day was a clockwork pattern of labor, maintenance, and small rituals that kept the entire floating world alive. Time on board was measured not by the sun alone, but by the ringing of the ship's bell. 8 bells marked the end of a 4-hour watch, and each watch divided the day and night into ordered fragments of duty. At dawn, the bosun's pipe called the men to clean the decks. Sand and seawater were spread across the planks, and holy stones, small blocks of sandstone, were used to scrub the surface until the wood shone pale and dry. This was not vanity, but necessity, for filth and damp bred disease, and a clean deck meant survival. The hierarchy of command was clear, as rigid as the rigging itself. At the summit stood the captain, a figure of authority who rarely shouted, but whose presence commanded the obedience of 800 souls. Below him were the commissioned officers, lieutenants responsible for navigation, gunnery, and discipline. Beneath them stood the warrant officers, the master, the bosun, the carpenter, the gunner, the surgeon, and the purser. Each was a specialist whose knowledge kept the ship alive. The master read the stars and measured the depth with lead and line. The carpenter inspected the hull for leaks and made repairs with oakum and pitch. The gunner tended to the ship's artillery, ensuring powder was dry and carriages sound. The surgeon, working in cramped quarters beneath the waterline, prepared for the casualties of both war and disease. Below these officers came the petty officers, the quartermasters, and the able seamen. Their hands handled the ropes, their backs bent to the sails, their muscles hauled the heavy guns. The youngest aboard were the boys, powder monkeys in battle, messengers in peace, some no older than 12, learning the language of the sea before they could write their own names. The system was old, and it worked because every man knew his place in the order of labor and risk. Each morning the crew turned the capstan to raise the anchor. The sound of the bars creaking in their sockets mingled with the calls of the bosun's mates, and the ship moved slowly against the current. When the sails were loosed, the canvas cracked like thunder. The wind filled the sheets, and the rigging tightened under the strain. From the quarterdeck, the officer of the watch directed the evolution, shouting orders that carried across the entire vessel. "Hands aloft to make sail! Sheet home! Brace the mainyard!" Dozens of men climbed to shrouds, moving like insects against the height of the masts, balancing on foot ropes to furl or unfurl the canvas. Each line had its name: fore topsail halyard, main brace, mizzen lift, and every sailor was expected to know them all by instinct.
Navigation in the 18th century depended on instruments as elegant as they were limited. The sextant measured the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon, and the chronometer, an invention only recently perfected, kept accurate time. With these, the master could calculate longitude and latitude, plotting the ship's position on a chart spread across the cabin table. Yet even the best instruments could not account for wind, current, and human error. Every voyage carried uncertainty, and the sea always had the last word. Below decks, life was crowded, dim, and full of noise. The lower gun deck was not only a battery, but also a living space. Between the guns, men slung hammocks from hooks in the beams, sleeping shoulder to shoulder. At dawn, the hammocks were lashed and stowed, the guns run out for exercise or cleaning. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, tar, and sweat. Ventilation came through open hatches when weather allowed. In storms, the hatches were closed, and the atmosphere turned close and suffocating. Rats scurried through the stores, feeding on crumbs and gnawing at rope. Cats were prized for keeping them in check. Food was a matter of endurance rather than pleasure. Each man received his daily ration, salted beef or pork, hardtack biscuits, dried peas, and sometimes oatmeal. Fresh provisions were rare and quickly spoiled. The bread was infested with weevils, but the sailors joked that the insects added protein. Water grew foul in its casks, so the common drink was beer or diluted rum, known as grog. Every day at noon the bosun's mates distributed the ration from large tubs, each man's portion measured carefully. It was a ritual of survival, a small comfort in an otherwise demanding life. Discipline held the ship together as tightly as the nails in her hull. The Articles of War, a set of regulations read aloud weekly, laid down punishments for every offense. Neglect of duty, theft, or insubordination could lead to flogging with the cat-o'-nine-tails. Desertion, mutiny, or cowardice in battle meant death. Yet the harshness of the system was balanced by a kind of rough justice. Courage, skill, and loyalty were rewarded with advancement, and among the men there grew a deep respect for those who shared danger without fear. When the sea turned violent, all ranks became equal before nature. In a gale, the ship became a living creature of terror and endurance. The masts strained, the yards groaned, and waves broke over the deck like collapsing walls. Men climbed aloft in the blackness, their fingers numbed to reef the sails and save the spars from snapping. The carpenter and his mate stood ready with pumps to keep the bilge from filling. Below, in the dark hold, the sound of water sloshing against the hull reminded everyone that the sea was always waiting to reclaim them. To survive a storm was to witness the raw limit of human power. When the weather calmed, the cycle of work resumed. Ropes were spliced, sails mended again, decks scrubbed again. The endless maintenance was not drudgery, but duty, for a warship that was not cared for would rot, leak, and die. Even the guns were polished daily. The brass gleamed, and the iron was blackened with oil to prevent rust. The surgeon inspected the crew for sickness. The chaplain, if one sailed aboard, held services on Sunday, reading from the Book of Common Prayer while the men stood bareheaded around the quarterdeck. Faith and superstition mingled freely. Some nailed coins to the mast for luck, others swore by omens and dreams. Battle, when it came, was the fulfillment of the ship's entire existence. To prepare for action, the crew cleared the decks for combat. Hammocks were lashed and piled along the bulwarks to form makeshift protection against splinters. The galley fires were extinguished, and sand was spread across the deck to soak up blood. The surgeon set up his tools in the cockpit below, laying out saws, knives, and bandages. The gunner inspected the powder magazine, ensuring every charge was ready. Silence settled over the ship, broken only by the low voices of officers giving final orders. At the signal to engage, the drums beat to quarters. Men ran to their stations. The gun ports opened, letting in bright stripes of daylight. The captain, standing on the quarterdeck, peered through his glass at the enemy line. When the range closed, he raised his hand, and the first broadside thundered. The recoil of 100 guns made the ship shudder as if struck by an earthquake. Smoke rolled through the decks, thick and choking. Commands became gestures. Communication relied on instinct. The crews worked in a rhythm: load, run out, fire, sponge, and load again. Amid the chaos, discipline was everything. A single spark near the magazine could end all lives in an instant. Powder boys darted back and forth with their charges, faces blackened with soot, eyes wide with fear and focus. Splinters flew like daggers as enemy shot struck the hull. The wounded were carried below. The surgeon worked by lantern light, his hands steady despite the screams. Victory's power lay not only in her guns, but in her ability to withstand punishment. Her oak sides, thick and layered, absorbed impacts that would have shattered smaller ships. Her design allowed her to fight broadside after broadside, holding the line in perfect order. The smoke of battle turned the sea gray and the sky invisible. Yet even in that confusion, each ship maintained its station, guided by signals flown from the admiral's flagship. When the firing ceased and the guns fell silent, the crew faced the aftermath. The decks were littered with splintered wood, torn ropes, and the fallen. Repairs began at once. Sails were patched, rigging replaced, leaks plugged with oakum and tar. The dead were sewn into hammocks with a cannonball at their feet and committed to the sea with solemn words. The living returned to their duties, the same as before, because the sea allowed no pause for mourning. To understand the working of a warship like HMS Victory is to see the union of countless hands and minds, bound by discipline and shared endurance. Every movement, the setting of a sail, the firing of a gun, the ringing of a bell, was part of a vast mechanical harmony. She was at once a machine and a community, a fortress and a home, a symbol of human order imposed upon the chaos of the ocean. As the 18th century drew toward its end, the world began to change. Steam and iron would soon replace wind and wood, and the language of the sea would shift forever. But the great sailing ships left behind a legacy of craftsmanship and courage that would never be forgotten. The HMS Victory, preserved to this day, remains the last living voice of that vanished world, a reminder that once, before the age of engines, the wind itself was the power that carried empires across the face of the earth. Battle, when it came, was the fulfillment of the ship's entire existence. To prepare for action, the crew cleared the decks for combat. Hammocks were lashed and piled along the bulwarks to form makeshift protection against splinters. The galley fires were extinguished, and sand was spread across the deck to soak up blood. The surgeon set up his tools in the cockpit below, laying out saws, knives, and bandages. The gunner inspected the powder magazine, ensuring every charge was ready. Silence settled over the ship, broken only by the low voices of officers giving final orders. At the signal to engage, the drums beat to quarters. Men ran to their stations. The gun ports opened, letting in bright stripes of daylight. The captain, standing on the quarterdeck, peered through his glass at the enemy line. When the range closed, he raised his hand, and the first broadside thundered. The recoil of 100 guns made the ship shudder as if struck by an earthquake. Smoke rolled through the decks, thick and choking. Commands became gestures. Communication relied on instinct. The crews worked in a rhythm: load, run out, fire, sponge, and load again. Amid the chaos, discipline was everything.
A single spark near the magazine could end all lives in an instant. Powder boys darted back and forth with their charges, faces blackened with soot, eyes wide with fear and focus. Splinters flew like daggers as enemy shot struck the hull. The wounded were carried below. The surgeon worked by lantern light, his hands steady despite the screams. Victory's power lay not only in her guns, but in her ability to withstand punishment. Her oak sides, thick and layered, absorbed impacts that would have shattered smaller ships. Her design allowed her to fight broadside after broadside, holding the line in perfect order. The smoke of battle turned the sea gray and the sky invisible. Yet even in that confusion, each ship maintained its station, guided by signals flown from the admiral's flagship. When the firing ceased and the guns fell silent, the crew faced the aftermath. The decks were littered with splintered wood, torn ropes, and the fallen. Repairs began at once. Sails were patched, rigging replaced, leaks plugged with oakum and tar. The dead were sewn into hammocks with a cannonball at their feet and committed to the sea with solemn words. The living returned to their duties, the same as before, because the sea allowed no pause for mourning. To understand the working of a warship like HMS Victory is to see the union of countless hands and minds, bound by discipline and shared endurance. Every movement, the setting of a sail, the firing of a gun, the ringing of a bell, was part of a vast mechanical harmony. She was at once a machine and a community, a fortress and a home, a symbol of human order imposed upon the chaos of the ocean. As the 18th century drew toward its end, the world began to change. Steam and iron would soon replace wind and wood, and the language of the sea would shift forever. But the great sailing ships left behind a legacy of craftsmanship and courage that would never be forgotten. The HMS Victory, preserved to this day, remains the last living voice of that vanished world, a reminder that once, before the age of engines, the wind itself was the power that carried empires across the face of the earth. The secret of a sailing warship's strength did not lie only in her cannons or her captain, but in the invisible web of geometry that kept her alive. Every rope, every block, every inch of canvas was part of a delicate equation written in wood and wind. The designers of the 18th century were not merely builders, they were mathematicians of motion who measured the invisible forces that turned a forest into a moving fortress. The hull of HMS Victory was carved according to the rule of symmetry and proportion. Beneath the graceful curve of her sides lay a precise relationship between buoyancy and ballast. Her lower hull, broad and rounded, held thousands of tons of stone and iron pigs arranged in careful layers. This ballast gave her stability, lowering her center of gravity so she would not capsize even when her sails were full. Above, the hull narrowed, its shape allowing water to flow cleanly along its sides. The stern curved upward like a shield, strong enough to carry the weight of the quarter galleries and the great lanterns that marked her rank as a ship of the line. The masts were her skeleton. The mainmast rose more than 200 feet from the keel to the truck, built from sections of pine joined with iron hoops. No single tree could reach such height. Each mast was a puzzle of timbers spliced together, aligned so perfectly that the whole stood firm under the weight of the wind. The yards that held the sails were likewise layered, their ends bound with rope and tar. The standing rigging, the shrouds and stays that held the masts upright, was made of hemp, tarred black to resist rot. It formed a network of tension that could be adjusted by hand, each line tuned like a string on an enormous instrument. When the ship pitched and rolled, the rigging absorbed the motion, creaking softly as it redistributed the strain. Sails were the ship's muscles. Each one was a vast piece of canvas woven from flax and treated with linseed oil to resist the sea. The largest, the mainsail, measured more than 6,000 square feet. Together, the sails formed a complex system of propulsion, their angles and tensions altering the airflow that pushed the ship forward. The helmsman, standing by the wheel at the stern, did not merely steer, he conversed with the wind. A single turn of the wheel could shift the balance of pressure across hundreds of feet of canvas. Orders from the quarterdeck flowed upward through the rigging. "Brace the foreyard! Haul the main sheet! Ease the mizzen!" Dozens of men answered, their motions synchronized through habit and trust. Beneath the decks, the carpenters and shipwrights tended to the hidden heart of the vessel. The hull seams were caulked with oakum, a mixture of hemp fibers and tar, pounded into every joint to make the ship watertight. Over time, the caulking dried and shrank, and so the carpenters carried mallets and irons to renew it. The bilge, that lowest space where water collected, had to be pumped constantly. 2 great chain pumps stood near the mainmast, each worked by a team of men turning handles that lifted the water up through copper pipes and out through scuppers in the side. The steady rhythm of the pumps became part of the ship's heartbeat, a reminder that even a sound hull leaked a little with every wave. Ventilation was a problem of life and death. Air moved poorly below decks, and the heat of hundreds of bodies made the lower decks oppressive. To combat this, Victory's builders installed windsails, long canvas funnels rigged to the hatches, capturing the breeze above and directing it downward. In calm weather, braziers of charcoal burned in iron cages to create a gentle draft, though they filled the air with a haze of smoke. The surgeon often complained that the air in the cockpit was worse than the stench of battle, yet no better system existed until the age of steam. The guns themselves were marvels of engineering, each a precisely balanced mechanism of wood, iron, and recoil. Victory carried more than 100 cannon, arranged in 3 tiers. The lower deck housed the 32-pounders, massive weapons, capable of hurling iron balls weighing as much as a child. Each gun rested on a carriage of oak, its wheels held by thick breeching ropes that absorbed the shock when fired. The crew of each gun worked like parts of a machine. At the command, "Run out!" they hauled the gun forward until its muzzle protruded through the port. "Fire!" and the deck leapt underfoot as the charge ignited. Smoke billowed, the carriage slammed backward, and the men leapt to reload before the order came again. To the untrained eye, it looked chaotic. To the practiced ear, it was music of discipline. The powder magazine was the most sacred space aboard. Hidden deep below the waterline, lined with copper to prevent sparks, it was entered only by men wearing felt slippers. No open flame was ever allowed near it. Lanterns shone through glass panes set into the walls, their light reflected indirectly so that the powder handlers worked in a strange twilight. Each cartridge was passed through a wooden hatch to the gunner's mates above, who carried it to the guns in covered boxes. The entire system was designed to contain risk, though accidents still occurred. A careless spark could turn the ship into a floating inferno. Water supply was another engineering challenge. The crew required thousands of gallons for drinking and cooking, stored in great oak casks in the hold. Fresh water quickly grew foul. The solution was constant replacement at port and careful rationing at sea. Saltwater baths were sometimes used for washing, though soap refused to lather in it. A network of scuppers and drains carried waste overboard. The management of filth, though rarely described in heroic terms, was a vital part of naval health. The wheel that controlled the rudder was connected by ropes and pulleys running through the decks to the tiller below. Each movement of the helmsman's hands translated into a slow motion of the great rudder blade, cutting the flow of water at the stern. In heavy seas, the strain was immense, and the ropes could snap if the rudder jammed. For emergencies, an auxiliary tiller was kept ready in the tiller room, where men could steer by brute force if the wheel was damaged. It was a reminder that even the finest craftsmanship required human muscle as its final guarantee. Above all these mechanical systems hovered the principle of balance. A ship too stiff would heel violently, too tender, and she would wallow sluggishly. The designers adjusted the rake of the masts, the spread of the sails, and the distribution of ballast until the motion felt right beneath the feet. They trusted not instruments, but instinct, the sense that the ship moved with the sea, not against it. Victory's builders succeeded so well that even after 2 centuries, she still sits upon the water with poise, her timbers flexing gently with every tide. Communication aboard was both simple and profound. The boatswain's call, a small whistle of silver, conveyed orders across the noise of wind and sea. Its shrill notes carried meaning even when words could not. A long trill for all hands, a rising tone for sail handling, a staccato for attention. Flags and lanterns relayed signals between ships, each combination representing a specific command. During battle, the admiral's flagship flew numbered flags that corresponded to codes printed in a book, an early form of binary language long before electricity was known. The fleet thus moved as one body, each ship a cell in a larger organism. Every aspect of life aboard depended on time, and time was measured by the bell and the glass. A half-hourglass stood by the mainmast. When its sand ran out, the bell was struck once, then twice, and so on up to 8. This rhythm marked the watches and the rotation of duties. It was the pulse of the ship's routine, a monotony that comforted the sailors as much as it confined them. The sound of the bell at sea, echoing across the waves, was the voice of order in a world of uncertainty. The artisans who maintained this system were numerous. The sailmaker worked in his small loft, surrounded by bolts of canvas and spools of twine, repairing tears by hand with needles as long as daggers. The blacksmith tended the forge on the orlop deck, hammering out nails, shackles, and hinges. The cooper shaped the wooden casks that held provisions. The rope-maker spliced lines, the caulker hammered oakum, the gunner mixed powder. Each trade existed within the confined space of the hull, and together they formed a society that could sustain itself for months without contact with land. A warship.
Navigation in the 18th century was a science of patience, an art of confidence, and sometimes an act of faith. A warship like HMS Victory carried within her not only men and guns, but the fragile knowledge that made the difference between landfall and disaster. Long before the era of engines and electricity, the great wooden ships of the line found their way across oceans by reading the sky, the wind, and the slow pulse of the earth itself. The master and his mates were the guardians of direction. They rose before dawn to take the first sight of the stars and the first smell of the sea. The smell mattered, for a change in scent could mean a shift in current or the nearness of land unseen. The master's tools were few but sacred: the sextant, the compass, the log line, and the chronometer. The sextant measured the angle between the horizon and the sun or a known star. The compass pointed toward magnetic north, though it drifted unpredictably with every iron nail in the hull. The log line was a rope knotted at intervals and thrown astern with a wooden chip. By counting the knots that ran through the sailor's fingers in a set time, the
The ship's speed could be found. From these fragments of information came charts and reckonings, the fragile geometry of survival.
The chronometer was a miracle of its age, a beating heart of brass that carried the time of Greenwich across the world. Before its invention, longitude was guesswork. With it, the master could compare local noon with the true time at home and know how far east or west he had sailed. The chronometer was kept in a wooden box, gimbaled to stay level even as the ship rolled. Only the captain or master touched it, winding it each day with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. In that ticking machine lay the measure of the empire's reach. Weather was the eternal companion of navigation. The sky above the mast was a living map. Cirrus wisps meant fair weather. A low dark ring around the horizon warned of storms. The sailors learned to read the sea's surface as one reads a book. The color of the water told of depth. The flight of birds foretold land. The curl of a wave revealed the strength of the wind. When the barometer's mercury dropped, men knew that within hours the sky would turn wild. Orders came swiftly. Reef topsails! Secure all loose gear! The ship braced for battle not against men, but against the elements. In a storm, navigation vanished and survival began. The wheel was lashed, the sails furled, and the masts groaned like living trees under strain. Waves taller than houses broke across the deck. Men clung to rigging slick with salt, their voices lost in the roar. Pumps worked without rest as the bilge filled. Lightning illuminated the chaos for an instant, showing faces pale and determined, then vanished again into darkness. When the gale passed, their survivors counted the cost. Sails were torn, spars splintered, ropes carried away. But the hull held, the oak ribs flexing with the rhythm of the sea, proof of the craftsmanship that had built her. Victory's builders had prepared her for such trials. Her hull planking was double-layered and cross-fastened, her decks supported by massive beams of English oak. The ship's shape allowed her to rise on waves rather than cut through them, trading speed for endurance. Below the waterline, the copper sheathing prevented the growth of barnacles and shipworm, reducing drag and decay. Every inch of her design was a compromise between strength and grace. The art of trimming the sails was as subtle as the reading of a map. The helmsman and the sailing master watched the telltales, small strips of cloth tied to the rigging that showed how the wind flowed across the canvas. To sail too close to the wind made the ship heel dangerously. Too far, and she lost power. The aim was always balance. The crew adjusted sheets and braces by inches, feeling the change through the soles of their feet as the deck responded. In this way, a ship was never truly still. She breathed with the wind, alive in every timber. At night, the sea became a different world. Lanterns were hooded to preserve the crew's night vision. The only sounds were the slap of water against the hull and the creak of ropes stretching in their blocks. The officer of the watch paced the quarterdeck, peering into darkness. Somewhere in the black distance, unseen waves broke on unseen shores. The stars were the only companions, and each had a name and a story. Sailors navigated by constellations that had guided their ancestors for centuries. The North Star, the Southern Cross, Orion's Belt. To look upward was to see both the past and the path ahead. When fog descended, the world shrank to the length of a cannon. Bells were struck at intervals to warn other ships, and the men moved cautiously, their voices muffled. Sound became the only sense that mattered. The ship's carpenter tapped the hull and listened for changes in echo that might indicate shallow water. The lead line was thrown constantly. Each sounding was called aloud, by the mark 5, by the deep 6. It was a conversation with the unseen depths. Life aboard a warship demanded constant repair. Wood swelled and shrank with moisture. Iron rusted. Canvas frayed.
The carpenter's crew worked without end, replacing planks, sealing leaks, splicing ropes. Tar was everywhere, on hands, on clothing, in the very air. The smell of it, mixed with salt and sweat, became the scent of the sea itself. Every task was both maintenance and memory, a way of keeping the ship alive long after her builders were gone. Fire was the most feared enemy. Lanterns were kept in cages, and open flames were forbidden except in the galley, where the cook's brick stove, called the caboose, burned under watch. Buckets of sand and water stood ready at all times. A single spark could consume a ship in minutes. The discipline that prevented such disasters was born of experience and repetition. Orders were followed not because of obedience alone, but because every man knew what failure meant. Over time, the ship became more than a machine to those who sailed her. Superstition and affection mingled until the crew spoke of victory as if she were alive. They touched her timbers before battle, whispered to her figurehead in secret. They believed she could feel the sea's mood and that she protected them when storms rose. The ship was their home, their world, and sometimes their grave. To leave her was to feel exile. Beyond the daily routine lay the great system of empire that sustained ships like her. Each voyage carried messages, orders, and trade across oceans. Harbors were filled with the echoes of hammering, the smell of pitch, and the shouts of dock workers loading powder and food. Shipyards along the Thames, the Medway, and the Solent turned raw timber into fleets. The Royal Navy was not merely a force of arms, but a web of labor stretching from forests to foundries. Each nail in Victory's hull had been forged by unseen hands in villages far from the sea. The navigation charts of the era were as much art as science. Hand-drawn, colored with inks and washes, they marked coastlines with delicate lines and imagined hazards with curling symbols. Some still bear sea monsters at their edges, remnants of older fears. To sail beyond the known was to step into myth, and even the most rational navigator felt a chill when crossing blank spaces on the map. In battle, navigation and gunnery became one. The helmsman steered not toward safety, but into danger, aligning the ship's broadside with the enemy. Wind direction, current, and timing determined victory or defeat. A shift of 10 seconds could change history. The master's calculations met the gunner's precision, and together they turned numbers into destruction. The discipline of peacetime practice found its terrible purpose. After each engagement, the ship's logs recorded the details, the bearings, the wind, the losses. These dry entries formed the hidden literature of the sea, the memory of generations who served and died in anonymity. To read them now is to hear the monotone of the past, the calm, methodical voice of men who faced chaos and wrote about it without emotion. Their language was spare because the sea allowed no sentiment. As the 18th century waned, new ideas began to stir. Experiments with steam power, iron plating, and new hull forms hinted at the coming revolution. Yet even as technology changed, the essence of seamanship remained. A sailor could still read the wind, tie a knot, and find his way by the stars. The lessons of the age of sail endured because they were written in experience rather than in books. The HMS Victory, preserved today in Portsmouth, is the last living witness to that time. Her timbers, though silent, still breathe the rhythm of the sea. Walking her decks is to feel the echo of countless footsteps, the creak of old rigging, the whisper of distant storms. Her survival is not merely historical, it is symbolic, a monument to human skill and endurance before the machine took command. The engineering of the 18th century was not mechanical alone. It was emotional and moral. It demanded trust between man and material, between command and obedience, between courage and fear.
A ship at sea was a fragile triumph over chaos, held together by faith as much as by rope and wood. And in that balance of order and uncertainty lay the true genius of the age, a world built not by engines, but by hands that understood both the strength and weakness of the human heart.
By the late 18th century, the sailing warship had reached the height of its evolution. It was both a weapon and a world, an organism of wood, iron, canvas, and discipline. Inside its hull, hundreds of men lived in layers, each layer serving a purpose, each movement rehearsed, each sound belonging to the endless rhythm of duty. HMS Victory, with her 100 guns and 3 towering masts, was the ultimate expression of that craft, the distilled knowledge of centuries of maritime labor and thought. The ship was a system before systems were known. Every block and tackle, every beam and bolt, every rope and nail served a function within a greater design. There was no part of her that could exist without reference to another. To understand her was to understand the philosophy of an age that believed in order, hierarchy, and precision. She was built not only to fight, but to endure, to symbolize the power of a nation that measured its strength by the size of its fleet. Below decks, the world narrowed and darkened. The smell was thick with tar, wood, salt, and men. Light came from a few lanterns, their glow caught on brass fittings and damp planks. The air was warm, still, and alive with the faint vibration of the sea against the hull. Every beam had been cut and shaped by hand, every joint fitted with care. The carpenter's tools had left marks still visible in the grain, traces of human hands long gone. On the gun deck, the great cannons slept in ordered ranks. Each was a creature of weight and purpose, its iron body bound with ropes and pulleys, its wheels greased and waiting. The gunners knew their weapons as a farmer knows his plow. Every piece had a name, a number, a rhythm of firing that was learned through endless drill. Powder boys, small, quick children, often no older than 12, carried charges from the magazine below. Silence was absolute before battle. Then, with a single word, the order began. "Run out your guns." The crews heaved together, the black muzzle sliding toward the open ports, sunlight glinting on bronze. The preparation for battle was not chaos, but choreography. Each man knew his place, each movement timed to the beat of the drum. The captain stood on the quarterdeck, composed, distant, his voice calm. Beneath him, the ship was a machine of muscle and will. When the first broadside thundered, the entire structure shook as if alive. Smoke rolled through the decks, filling lungs and eyes. The roar of cannon fire merged with the cries of men and the splintering of wood. In minutes, the ordered calm became a haze of noise and motion, but the order beneath it never failed. Even in destruction, there was discipline. The magazines below were sanctuaries of danger. The powder room was lined with copper to prevent sparks. No iron tools were allowed. The gunner's mates wore soft slippers and handled every cask as if it were a sleeping god. A single careless gesture could end the ship and all aboard. The powder was measured with precision, passed up through the decks by a chain of hands. Above, the gunners loaded, sponged, rammed, and fired, following motions repeated so often they had become instinct. After battle, the silence that followed was not peace, but exhaustion. The decks were washed of blood, the wounded carried below, the surgeons saw working behind a curtain. The ship's carpenter patched holes with planks cut from spare timber. Ropes were spliced, sails restitched, spars replaced. The sea accepted the dead without ceremony. Life continued because it must. The warship could not rest. Her purpose was constant readiness.
Between battles, the machinery of order reasserted itself. Every morning began with the boatswain's whistle, a shrill cry that summoned the crew to work. Ropes were coiled, decks scrubbed with sand, brass polished, hammocks stowed. The rhythm of labor was its own kind of music, endless, precise, cleansing. Meals were taken in turns, served from a single pot, salted meat and hard biscuit softened in broth. Water was rationed, beer was safer. The surgeon inspected the crew daily for sickness. The chaplain read prayers. The purser counted every ration. Discipline aboard a warship was both law and religion. The articles of war hung in every mess, a reminder of obedience and consequence. Flogging was the common punishment, carried out with the whole crew assembled. It was not cruelty for its own sake, but a ritual of order. The sound of the lash, the silence of the onlookers, the formality of the surgeon's presence, these were all part of the same design that held the ship together. Without discipline, a warship would dissolve into chaos, and chaos meant death. The officer's world was different, but equally confined. The captain's cabin at the stern was a place of quiet authority. It was paneled with polished wood, its windows opening to the wake. Here he wrote in his log, studied charts, and received reports. His decisions carried the weight of life and death, yet he lived within a few square feet of space. His meals were served on fine china. His bed was narrow, his privacy almost non-existent. Rank was both privilege and burden. The midshipmen, young men in training for command, lived between worlds. They were educated, ambitious, and often lonely. Their duties included navigation, signaling, and supervising the men. They learned through hardship, the sting of rope burns, the exhaustion of night watches, the endless study of mathematics and seamanship. Promotion came slowly, and failure was easy. Many never rose beyond the lower ranks, lost to disease, or battle, or simple bad luck. The science behind the ship's construction was a marvel of its time. Naval architects worked with little more than geometry, intuition, and experience. They drew the curves of the hull on vast wooden floors called mold lofts, tracing arcs with flexible battens. The shape of the bow, the rake of the stern, the angle of the keel, all were adjusted by eye. Yet the results were masterpieces of balance and endurance. A ship like Victory could sail for decades if properly maintained. The oak that formed her came from forests that had grown for centuries. Each tree was chosen for its natural curve, its strength, its grain. Shipwrights could look at a branch and see a future beam or knee. It took more than 2,000 trees to build a ship of the line, and once launched, she carried the memory of those forests across the world. In this sense, every warship was both a machine and a monument to the land from which it came. The copper sheathing that lined her hull was another quiet revolution. Before its adoption, ships suffered from fouling, barnacles and seaweed that clung to the wood, slowing progress. Copper resisted both corrosion and marine life, allowing a cleaner, faster passage. The idea was first met with doubt. Many believed the metal would poison the crew or corrode the iron fastenings. But when trials proved its worth, the practice spread rapidly. It was one of the few moments when the slow world of tradition embraced change willingly. The rigging above was a web of astonishing complexity. Every rope had a name, every knot a purpose. The mainmast alone carried more than 100 lines. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. To the sailor, it was logic. In storms or battle, the crew climbed those ropes with the ease of instinct, balancing on yards high above the deck, their lives held by tarred hemp and faith. They worked in silence, often at night, trusting their hands more than their eyes. Communication between ships was a language of flags, flares, and drums. Each flag carried a meaning, and combinations could form entire sentences. During battle, messages rippled through the fleet like coded prayers. Misreading a single signal could alter the fate of nations. The flag lieutenant's job was one of constant attention and absolute precision. The logistics of warfare extended far beyond the ship itself. Dockyards, rope walks, and foundries supplied the materials. Merchants transported powder and provisions. The Admiralty managed accounts, pay, and records with the same rigor as a merchant firm. Behind every broadside stood 1,000 invisible hands. The Navy was not merely an arm of war, it was the spine of an empire that measured its reach in nautical miles. When peace came, as it sometimes did, the ships were laid up in ordinary, their masts struck, their hulls moored, their crews dismissed. They slept in silence, waiting for the next call to arms. Some rotted away in dock, others were broken up, their timbers reused in homes and furniture. But a few, like HMS Victory, endured, kept as symbols of pride and memory. Time weathered their planks, but not their meaning. To walk through the remains of such a ship today is to feel the slow heartbeat of history. The beams above creak faintly, the ropes hang in stillness, and the air carries the scent of salt and tar that no century can erase. The warship was not just an invention of engineering, it was an expression of human endurance, of courage shaped by repetition, and of order imposed upon an indifferent sea. The 18th century believed that with enough discipline, geometry, and faith, man could master nature. The warship was proof of that belief, and also its limit. For all its strength, it remained fragile before wind and wave, a floating testament to the delicate balance between creation and destruction. In that paradox lies the beauty of the age of sail and the quiet melancholy that lingers long after the last cannon fell silent. By the first decades of the 19th century, the world that had built ships like HMS Victory was beginning to fade. The wars that had given her purpose had ended, leaving the seas strangely calm. Empires still ruled their colonies, trade still flowed, and the Royal Navy still stretched across the globe. But something subtle had changed. The great age of the sailing line of battleship, the intricate world of canvas, oak, and discipline, was drawing to its quiet conclusion. In the long calm after Trafalgar, Britain stood unchallenged upon the seas. The fleet was vast, the dockyards full, the tradition strong. Yet peace carried its own erosion. The rhythm of constant battle had kept the Navy alive. Without it, the structure stiffened. Ships were kept in reserve, their hulls drying slowly in the sun. Crews were reduced, then dismissed. The tools of war became relics. And as the world industrialized, the sea, once mastered by wind, began to respond to new kinds of power. It began modestly, almost invisibly, in small vessels that moved without sails. The first steam engines at sea were crude affairs, noisy, inefficient, prone to explosion. They belonged to riverboats and tugs, not to ships of war. But progress in the 19th century had a way of creeping forward without pause. Engineers refined the machinery, improved the boilers, and found ways to convert coal into motion. Where once the wind had ruled, smoke began to rise. The old sailors watched with suspicion. Steam seemed a violation of nature itself. To them, the sea was a living thing, and the wind was its voice. A ship that ignored the wind was an unnatural creature. They spoke of the new engines with disdain, calling them iron monsters, soulless and heavy. Yet even as they mocked, they saw the truth. Steam offered certainty. It ignored calm seas,
overcame headwinds, and made schedules possible. What it lacked in grace, it possessed in reliability.
For a time, the two ages overlapped. Hybrid ships appeared. Sail and steam combined, canvas above and screw below. They looked awkward, half one thing, half another. Engineers debated, admirals hesitated, tradition clashed with innovation. In the shipyards, oak was still king, but iron was beginning to intrude. Iron plates reinforced keels, iron bolts held timbers together. Iron engines beat like mechanical hearts below decks once built for powder and shot. HMS Victory herself, by then an aging veteran, was refitted and repaired, serving as a flagship, a training ship, a relic of another era kept alive by reverence and memory. Her guns were polished, her decks maintained, but the world around her was changing too quickly for her to keep up. The men who had once manned her kind were now engineers rather than sailors, machinists rather than gunners. The smell of coal smoke began to replace the scent of tar and salt. Life aboard HMS Victory was a blend of precision, hardship, and unrelenting discipline. Every man, from the captain to the youngest powder monkey, had a role, and the success or survival of the ship depended on their ability to work as one living mechanism of oak and iron. The day began with the boatswain's whistle and the call of "all hands" echoing through the decks. Sailors rose from their hammocks, slung side by side in rows, barely a foot apart in the cramped lower decks. The smell of tar, sweat, and salted beef filled the stale air. They folded their hammocks neatly, for at sea even sleep had a schedule. Breakfast was meager, hardtack biscuits that could break a tooth, often infested with weevils, and a ration of ale or watered-down rum. Meals were eaten in silence, except for the scrape of tin utensils and the creak of the hull. The workday stretched endlessly. Men climbed the rigging high above the rolling sea, balancing on swaying ropes to furl or unfurl sails as the ship's officers barked orders. On deck, carpenters inspected planks for leaks, gunners polished cannon barrels until they gleamed, and the ship's surgeon checked his crude instruments, saws, forceps, and brandy, tools of both healing and horror. The rhythm of the ship was dictated by bells. Every half hour the ship's bell was struck, marking the passage of time in watches. There was no real day or night at sea, only duty and rest, endlessly alternating. Discipline was absolute. A single mistake could mean disaster. Sailors could be flogged for drunkenness, insubordination, or even minor disobedience. The cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip made of knotted cords, tore flesh and left scars as warnings to others. Yet, despite the brutality, the crew respected the chain of command. Survival depended on unity. Officers lived slightly better. Their cabins at the stern were cramped, but offered privacy, maps, and perhaps a bottle of port. The captain's quarters, decorated with polished wood and brass instruments, served as both command post and home. Nelson himself, aboard Victory, was known for his charisma, strict yet inspiring loyalty through courage and presence rather than fear alone. Amid the monotony, there were moments of wonder. At sunset, when the sea glowed red and gold, sailors sang shanties that told of distant lands and lovers left behind. The songs kept rhythm during labor, but they were also the crew's way of remembering who they were, men of earth and sea, caught between duty and dream. Below deck, gun crews practiced constantly, rolling the massive cannons in and out, ramming in powder and shot until every motion became instinct. A well-trained crew could fire a broadside every 2 minutes, a feat of deadly choreography. The surgeon's mate might stitch wounds from minor accidents, and the ship's purser managed food stores, carefully doling out salt beef, dried peas, and rum. Everything was rationed. Fresh water grew foul after weeks. Sickness spread quickly in the humid dark. And yet, morale was kept alive by stories, tales of past battles, ghost ships seen in fog, or rumors of rich prize vessels waiting beyond the horizon. Hope and superstition mingled freely aboard Victory, for sailors were as much believers in fate as in skill. At night the ship rocked gently, the creak of ropes mingling with the sighs of exhausted men. The lanterns dimmed, shadows danced across the beams, and above them all, through the gun ports, stars glimmered like distant fires of home. It was a hard life, a dangerous life, but for many it was the only life they knew, and aboard HMS Victory, under the ever-watchful eyes of officers and the rising sea, that life became part of something greater, a machine of empire, built on discipline, courage, and unbreakable routine. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, the decks of HMS Victory came alive with tension. The air was heavy with gunpowder, salt, and the unmistakable electricity of war. Ahead lay the combined French and Spanish fleets, stretching across the horizon in a deadly line of cannon and sail. The year was 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar. The crew moved with mechanical precision. Powder monkeys ran barefoot, hauling gunpowder from the magazine to the cannons. Officers barked orders through the roar of the wind, while Nelson stood on the quarterdeck in full uniform, his single good arm clasped behind his back, the other tucked into his coat. His signal flags fluttered overhead. England expects that every man will do his duty. It was more than an order. It was a promise. When the first broadside thundered, the world vanished in smoke and flame. The oak walls trembled under impact. Cannonballs ripped through the decks, and the cries of wounded men mixed with the crashing of the sea. Yet Victory held her line, pressing forward into the storm of iron. Below decks, chaos reigned. The gun decks were shrouded in smoke, the heat suffocating. Barefoot sailors slipped on blood and seawater as they rammed home powder and shot, each broadside shaking the ship to its bones. The surgeon's station filled with groaning men, limbs torn away, faces pale with shock. Amid the horror, he worked by lantern light, sawing, stitching, whispering prayers that drowned beneath the thunder of war. Above, Nelson paced the deck calmly, a strange serenity in his eyes. Cannon fire shattered the mizzenmast. Splinters flew like daggers. A musket ball struck him in the shoulder and lodged in his spine. He fell quietly, carried below by 2 Marines. "Hardy," he whispered to his flag captain as the battle raged overhead, "I feel something within me that tells me I shall not live." Even dying, he asked only one thing: "How goes the battle?" "Victory is ours," came the reply. A faint smile touched his lips. "Thank God," he said, "I have done my duty." With that, Admiral Horatio Nelson, the soul of the British Navy, slipped into silence, even as HMS Victory continued to thunder her guns across the sea. When the smoke cleared, the Franco-Spanish line was shattered. The enemy fled or surrendered. The cost was immense, but Britain's naval supremacy was sealed for a century. The battle was over. The ocean, as always, was quiet again. In the years that followed, HMS Victory became more than a ship. She became a symbol of courage, of sacrifice, of an age when men built floating fortresses from oak and iron and fought not for wealth but for honor and survival. Her hull, riddled with scars, was repaired again and again. Her decks, once washed in blood and rain, became a place of remembrance. Visitors would walk those same planks centuries later, tracing the grain of wood that once bore the weight of history. And as the modern world grew around her, HMS Victory remained, still moored at Portsmouth, still upright, still proud. The echoes of her cannons are long gone, but her timbers whisper stories of wind and fire, of men who lived and died in service to something greater than themselves. If you stand aboard her today, the sea wind carries faint sounds, the creak of rigging, the muffled beat of drums, the echo of Nelson's final words. It feels as though time itself holds its breath, guarding that moment when a wooden ship and her crew became immortal. For HMS Victory is no longer just a vessel. She is memory itself, anchored forever between glory and the endless horizon.